You ever notice how epic always skips the mud? I'm your bedtime historian, and tonight I'd like to walk you barefoot through the squelching, smoky, surprisingly soggy truth of Viking daily life. No sword fights, just cold feet and questionable smells. A single room longhouse warmed by fire and sweat. Animal fur nailed to the walls. A stew pot forever bubbling, not in luxury, but because reheating was easier than cleaning. And always that slow, rhythmic drip from a roof that never fully kept the weather out. How did anyone sleep? Why did no one fix the leaks? And how exactly did they manage with a cow in the kitchen? If you're still awake, hit like and subscribe. Not for me, for the goat quietly chewing hay beside your straw mattress. He thanks you for the attention. Ever tried falling asleep next to livestock? Whisper your favorite weird roommate situation in the comments, historical or otherwise. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You duck under the lintel beam, careful not to bump your head, though in this house everyone's already used to bruises. Inside the Viking longhouse, light filters through slits in the roof, smoky and pale. Your eyes water as you adjust, not from emotion, but from the sheer quantity of wood smoke hanging in the air like fog with an attitude. The walls are made of wattle and daub woven sticks caked with mud, and they sag ever so slightly, just enough to make the building feel like it's sighing from the effort of standing. The ceiling is blackened with soot, and the hearth in the center has no chimney, only a hole above which may or may not align with where the smoke wants to go. Spoiler, it usually doesn't. You shuffle past an old man mumbling into a bowl of watery porridge and a child trying to teach a goat not to eat her braids. Everyone lives here, parents, grandparents, children, animals. Privacy. That's a word for future centuries. The floor is earthen-packed dirt that turns to sludge every spring. You notice footprints of varying sizes hardened into last month's mud. They don't even try to sweep anymore. Why bother? It'll just flood again when the roof gives in. Straw bedding is shared, as are fleas. Warmth comes from proximity, preferably human, but pigs will do in a pinch. The family huddles on raised wooden platforms covered in woolen blankets that smell strongly of smoke and slightly less strongly of cabbage. That cabbage smell. It's the stew, eternal and mysterious, consisting of whatever's available and simmered for days, sometimes weeks. Today it's turnips, yesterday's bones, and a hint of dried fish. Or maybe rat. Nobody asks. Roof leaks are constant. A soft plop-plop of dripping water punctuates the silence. Children place wooden bowls beneath the leaks, trying to guess which one will fill first. It's a game, sort of. Some archaeologists believe these homes were occasionally aired out, doors thrown open to let in the breeze and chase away the stink. Others scoff at the idea, pointing to thick thatch roofs and tightly woven walls that trapped more than just heat. In this cramped space, everything has a smell: damp wool, old sweat ash, manure, boiled onions. You'd think your nose would give up, but it doesn't. It just becomes numb, like your feet, which haven't felt dry in months. The irony: Vikings prized hospitality. Guests were welcome, even honored. Imagine stepping into this stew of smoke, animals, and odors, and having to pretend it was charming. But you do. You sit near the hearth, careful not to catch your tunic on the edge of the fire pit, and someone hands you a ladle of something warm. It's awful, but it's home. The smoke has barely cleared from your tunic when dawn drags you outside. No roaring adventure awaits, just a hoe, a frostbitten patch of earth, and a full day of squinting into cold wind. Welcome to the real backbone of Viking life, farming without flair. The fields stretch ahead, not in golden waves, but in stubborn tufts of half-thawed dirt and icy slush. You grip a wooden hoe, its edge dulled by time and stones, and begin the thankless task of tilling a field that resents your effort. Each scrape pulls up more rock than soil. Your back protests within minutes, but the land doesn't care. Viking farmers, who made up the vast majority of the population, lived at the mercy of northern weather. Winters were long, summers were short. Spring arrived like a hungover guest, late, slushy, and unreliable. You needed to sow quickly before the soil hardened again, and pray the seeds didn't rot in a surprise hailstorm. You dig and sweat layered in wool that traps both warmth and damp. There's no such thing as dry out here, only less wet. Your breath mists in the air, and your fingers sting even under thick gloves. Somewhere nearby, a raven calls. You wonder if it's laughing. Barley was the crop of choice, rugged, fast-growing, and just barely edible. Turnips and cabbages joined in when they could. Wheat was rare, bread even rarer. Most grain was used for porridge or beer, depending on your priorities and the yield. There's ongoing debate among historians about just how self-sufficient Viking farms really were. Some argue they could sustain entire families with careful planning and lots of dried fish. Others believe these households lived on a knife's edge, constantly one storm away from hunger. Midday comes with no break. Lunch is whatever you brought out with you, probably a hunk of hard cheese, a bit of smoked fish, and coarse barley bread that requires effort to chew. You eat standing up because sitting would mean getting up again. In the distance, smoke curls from the longhouse chimney, if you can call it that. A hole that promises heat, but mostly delivers drafts. You glance toward the barn where the animals are beginning to stir. Their needs will come next. Feeding, cleaning, maybe chasing the neighbor's goat off your cabbage again. There's no such thing as done here. Evenings don't arrive with rest. After the fields, there's mending tools, fetching water, checking the fences, rubbing balm on cracked hands, and worrying about next season. You catch your reflection in a puddle, mud-smeared face, wind-chapped cheeks, hair plastered to your forehead. Not exactly the image sold in Viking sagas. Yet, here's the quiet truth these farmers made the raiders possible. They fed the warriors, built the ships, kept the culture alive. Without them, no one would remember anything. A child calls from the edge of the pasture. A sheep is stuck in the fence again. You sigh, grab your cloak, and trudge over, because in Viking life, the next task always finds you before you finish the last. There's something about cold wool on bare skin that reminds you how much comfort is a modern invention. Dressing like a Viking isn't about looking fierce. It's about accepting that every part of you will itch at some point during the day. You wake, stretch, and immediately scratch. The tunic you slept in doubled as your daytime outfit. Made of coarse wool and vaguely tunic-shaped, it smells like firewood, goat, and effort. It's too long to run in and too short to be warm around the knees. Still, it's better than nothing barely. Vikings didn't wear horned helmets, but they did layer their clothes. A linen undertunic if you were lucky, a woolen overtunic definitely. Cloaks clasped with brooches helped break the wind. Trousers were tied at the calf, with crisscrossed bands making your legs look like oddly wrapped presents. Shoes, soft leather, thin as pastry, with holes that doubled as ventilation unintentionally. The morning routine involves brushing dried mud off yesterday's garments and pretending that makes them clean. There's no soap involved, just a brisk shake, a few slaps against the wall, and the distant hope that snow will scrub things off when you walk through it. You run a bone comb through your hair. It hurts. A louse tumbles out, and you flick it into the fire as tradition and survival demands. Vikings were notoriously meticulous about grooming weekly baths, combs for every household, and even tweezers. And yet, lice and fleas thrived anyway, like rude guests who brought their own snacks. Some textiles were dyed, though most weren't. Browns, grays, and yellows came from plants and minerals. But if you saw someone in red, you stared just a little. Red dye required madder root or imported cinnabar, both expensive. A crimson cloak meant status or ambition, or someone willing to trade 3 sheep for a dramatic entrance. Women wore long woolen dresses with apron panels held by turtle brooches, no actual turtles involved, thankfully. Jewelry wasn't just decoration, it signaled wealth, marriage, even origin. A missing brooch could be as scandalous as a missing tooth. Historians disagree about the purpose of Viking fashion. Was it practical or performative? Some argue the layered look was pure utility survival against the elements. Others point to the embroidery color choices and decorative pins as evidence of social signaling. Your cloak still smells of herring from the last village trip. You rub a bit of ash under your arms, not deodorant, but it cuts the scent. Sort of. At least it gives you something to blame. And don't forget the belts. Thick leather ones with dangling tools, knives, fire strikers, little pouches. Pockets didn't exist yet, so everything had to hang. You jingle like a nervous keychain as you walk. The final touch is a hat or hood, often fur-lined if you were rich or resourceful. It keeps your ears intact through the wind. Your neighbor's didn't once. He wears a lopsided cap now. Says it adds character. Dressed at last, you exhale into the cold. You don't look like a saga hero. But then again, neither did they. Not really. The cold slaps your cheeks awake long before the water does. Washing as a Viking means braving the elements, improvising with odd ingredients, and redefining what clean actually feels like. It's not about freshness, it's about function, ritual, and sometimes sheer bravery. You trudge down to the stream, soap in hand, not the bubbly, lemon-scented kind, but a gritty lump made of ash, animal fat, and wishful thinking. It's gray coarse and smells faintly like the worst part of a campfire. You rub it between your hands and the texture feels more like sandpaper than lather. The stream is half frozen. You break a thin crust of ice with a stick, then dunk your hands in. They seize up, immediately turning red with cold. You splash your face trying to ignore the shock that travels up your spine. Invigorating is one word for it. Unforgivable is another. Contrary to the grimy warrior stereotype, Vikings bathed more often than most medieval Europeans. Weekly washing on Saturdays, in fact, was common enough to have its own day name, Lagerdager, or Washing Day. But don't get too excited. Warm water was a luxury. Often it was the icy lake or a bucket fetched from a distant spring. You strip off your tunic, shivering in the wind, and kneel beside the water. A handful of ash soap, a quick scrub, a brief debate about whether it's worth washing your hair today. You try anyway, only to regret it when your scalp goes numb halfway through. Somewhere across the way, a neighbor laughs. You suspect he skipped bath day. There were no towels, just a brisk rubbing with a wool cloak or letting the wind do its worst. You stand and shake like a soggy dog, teeth chattering. Cleanish, maybe. Some scholars think Viking washing had more to do with ritual than hygiene. Bathing before feasts, before travel, even before battle moments, when one was meant to face the world with composure and dignity. Others argue it was purely practical lice, itched less when your hair wasn't oily, and dirt freezes harder on greasy skin. During winter, hot baths were nearly impossible unless you lived near a hot spring, rare and prized. Most settlements managed with steam huts like primitive saunas. Inside stones were heated in fires and then doused with water to fill the space with steam. You'd sweat scrub with birch branches and hope it was enough. You finish rinsing and wring out your under tunic, which now resembles a soggy towel. It'll freeze stiff if you don't hang it near the fire soon. The walk back to the longhouse feels twice as long when you're damp and half naked. Your teeth rattle out a rhythm as you go, inside someone's boiling stew again. The smoke curls around you like a musky welcome. You hang your wet clothes by the hearth and wrap up in a scratchy blanket, grateful for the heat, even if it smells like old onions and disappointment. You're cleaner than you were. Not clean, just less filthy. And that's about as good as it gets. The fire hisses behind you, but your stomach growls louder. It's time to eat, though. Calling it dinner might be generous. Viking meals weren't feasts of roasted meat and golden goblets. They were survival disguised as soup, and sometimes not even that. You dip a ladle into the thick gray pot hanging over the hearth. The contents slosh like wet clay. Barley gruel again this time, with bits of fish floating in it, their eyes long since boiled away. You sniff. It's fine. Edible. Mostly. You spoon it into a wooden bowl and try not to look too closely. The Viking diet relied heavily on preservation, smoking, drying, salting, and fermenting. Fish was the backbone, herring, cod, and whatever else they could haul in. Dried in the sun or buried in cool pits, it kept for months, or turned. Sometimes it was hard to tell the difference. You chew, it's chewy. The flavor is somewhere between salt and sadness. Occasionally you bite into a peppercorn or mustard seed, tiny flashes of excitement imported by the wealthy or stolen by the bold. But most meals are quiet, repetitive, and rough on the teeth. Meat was rare despite modern imagination. Cows and sheep were too valuable alive for milk, wool, and labor. When meat did appear, it was usually from old or injured animals and often boiled until everything tough became edible mush. You'd think that made it tender. It didn't. During winter, pickled cabbage and sour milk filled the gap. Vikings made skyr a yogurt-like dairy product that tasted like curdled determination. Leftovers were cherished even if slightly rancid. Waste was unthinkable, and appetites adapted. Some researchers argue the Viking diet was surprisingly nutritious. Lean proteins, fermented vegetables, and whole grains balanced out the scarcity. Others point to widespread signs of malnutrition in skeletons and wonder if we're romanticizing hardship. You glance around. A child sucks on a dried fishtail like candy. An elder spits a bone into the fire and sighs with contentment. They aren't pretending this is good, it just is. Familiar, filling, and warm. Seasonal treats arrive on holidays, fresh bread if the barley yield was good, maybe honey if someone braved a hive. Beer made from whatever grains hadn't molded brought brief cheer and headaches. But every bite had to be earned, stored, and rationed. Nothing was guaranteed. You slurp another spoonful, ignoring the faint crunch of sand. The fish may have come with a bit of beach. That's flavor, you tell yourself. Texture, personality. Every meal leaves you slightly grateful, slightly queasy. It's a balance. You scrape the bowl clean with a bit of rye crust and tuck it under your arm. Washing up is a tomorrow problem. The longhouse dims as smoke thickens near the roof again. Someone opens the door to let the worst of it out. You watch your breath cloud the air and realize you're full. Not satisfied, but full. And for a Viking, that's enough. The sun vanishes early and takes your motivation with it. Winter in a Viking settlement doesn't whisper, it presses heavy and endless. Outside, snow buries the fields. Inside, the loom takes over your life. You sit cross-legged near the hearth spindle in hand, while threads stretch across a massive upright loom like a wooden gate to nowhere. The fire crackles, barely lighting the space. Shadows play across the fur-covered walls as you pull wool through your fingers, one tedious tug at a time. Spinning, weaving, mending. These aren't hobbies, they're lifelines. Viking households relied on wool textiles for clothing, sails, bedding, and trade. And who made them mostly women. Day after day, strand by strand, weaving not just cloth, but survival. You yank a knot free and keep going. The rhythm is hypnotic, twist, pass, pull, tighten. Your fingers go numb, not from cold, but repetition. Outside, wind howls like a bored ghost. Inside, only the creak of wood and the occasional grunt of a pig shifting in its sleep. Firelight flickers on nearby skins, scraped and drying. The air smells of lanolin and smoke, with the faint edge of urine the traditional softener for wool, believe it or not. Someone drops more peat onto the fire. The smell shifts again now, earthy and oddly sweet. In this darkness, time loses shape. There's no clock, just chores. When your arms tire from weaving, you sew. When your back aches from sewing, you card wool. The days blur. The weeks sink into silence. Conversation drifts in and out, mostly about weather and food, or stories. Quiet tales half whispered about old gods, odd dreams, or people you once knew who vanished in a storm. Was this peace or just tedium? Some scholars suggest Viking women found a kind of meditative solace in the loom's steady rhythm. Others argue it was mental punishment, dressed as duty, especially during months with little light and less warmth. Children hover nearby, carding wool, or chasing each other with stray needles. An older woman eyes your weaving and nods silently. Approval, rare and welcome. You smile, then prick your finger on a hidden splinter and silently curse the loom, the wool, and winter itself. Evenings stretch long. After chores, there's mending of socks, cloaks, and occasionally relationships. You patch a sleeve and listen to your neighbor argue with her goat again. The goat always wins. You reach for the dye pot frozen. Of course, no new colors until spring. Everything remains gray-beige or the hopeful brown of rewashed rust. Still you imagine red. Just a touch. Maybe one line across a sleeve to break the sameness. Eventually you wrap the half-finished cloth and store it by the wall. Your shoulders ache. You've woven 3 feet today. Tomorrow, maybe 2 more. In a month, a tunic. In a year, a sail. You stretch your arms and move closer to the fire. The loom looms behind you unmoved, waiting. And you wonder if threads remember the fingers that pulled them through. The hearth may warm your hands, but nothing shields you from what's coming. Childbirth in the Viking Age wasn't just a private ordeal. It was a gamble played in silence, in shadow, and often in sorrow. You kneel on a pile of straw, clutching the hand of a laboring woman. Her face is slick with sweat despite the winter chill. She bites down on a strip of leather, stifling her screams. There's no midwife, only neighbors with strong stomachs and older women with stories that pass for wisdom. Her belly contracts again. You whisper something soft, meaningless, but steady. The longhouse is hushed. Even the goats are quiet. There are no sterile tools, no herbs strong enough to dull the pain. A clay pot of hot water sits nearby, not to clean, but to warm cloths and hands. Someone fetches a carved wooden spoon. It's not for feeding, but for gripping when the pain claws its way in. Childbirth was the leading cause of death for Viking women. With no antibiotics and minimal knowledge of anatomy, infection, hemorrhage, or breech birth, often turned a joyful moment into mourning. For every baby born, a mother's silence might follow. You press down on her shoulder as the next wave hits. She grits her teeth. There's blood now, and tears. You wonder whether to call for the elder woman, who sometimes chants during births, offering prayers to Freya or Frigg. Some believed gods watched over mothers. Others said the gods watched but rarely helped. Some scholars argue that Viking women held spiritual authority during childbirth, that birthing rooms were semi-sacred spaces, a strange blend of power and fear. Others note how little evidence survives, no detailed rituals, few grave goods, silence in the sagas. Perhaps birth was simply too common or too private to preserve. The baby arrives with a thin, wet cry, a sound so small it barely fills the room, yet feels enormous. You wrap it in wool, the coarseness rubbing gently against its red skin. The mother slumps exhausted. She's breathing. You're grateful. For now. You place the baby beside her, watching for signs. Steady breaths, open eyes, warmth. Many infants didn't survive the first week. Those that did were often unnamed until later. It was easier that way emotionally. You give this one a nickname just in case. Later, you pour the leftover water outside, not into the latrine, but into the earth, quietly. Some believed it carried spirits. Some just didn't want the goats drinking it. You help the mother drink a bit of broth. Her lips tremble. She asks if it's a boy or girl. You tell her. She nods, then closes her eyes. You don't leave. The fire crackles. A new life blinks in the dimness, swaddled in fabric, spun by the same hands that scraped hides and stirred stew. The room is still for now. You clean the floor with snow and old rags. No one will mention this night again, not unless another baby comes. Or unless it doesn't. Dawn arrives pale and damp, and with it a groan from the man in the corner. He hasn't stood in 2 days, not since a fall in the sheep pen. His leg is swollen purple and twice its usual size. Medicine Viking style is less about healing and more about enduring. You kneel beside him, peeling back a rough wool blanket. The smell hits first, sour, sharp, and worrying. There's no doctor, no surgeon, just you. A handful of passed-down remedies and a deep breath you wish you hadn't taken. He winces as you press gingerly around the injury. Broken, sprained. It's hard to say. You grab a splint made from birch wood, bound with strips of linen soaked in sheep fat. Yes, really. It's said to soften swelling and keep spirits away. Or maybe just keep the flies off. For fever, you have options: garlic mashed into a paste and smeared on the chest, or boiled yarrow to sip if he can stomach it. You try both. He gags. You offer him a chunk of bread to mask the taste. He chews like he's being punished. Viking healing was a blend of herbalism, faith, and guesswork. Some remedies worked. Willow bark, for instance, did help with pain. Others were more symbolic, like chanting while tying knots in a cord, or placing iron nails under a sickbed to trap the illness. You grind juniper berries and smear the pulp on a toothache patient. She winces, then sighs. It numbs a little. Maybe. You remind her not to bite down too hard. No one wants to fish splinters out of gum again. Wounds were packed with moss soaked in honey or animal fat. Infection was feared but poorly understood. Some treated it with hot stones pressed to the skin. Others with silence and hope. Many didn't make it. There is no scholarly consensus on just how effective Viking medicine was. Some believe it was surprisingly sophisticated, especially their knowledge of plants and antiseptics. Others argue that without surgical tools or germ theory, most treatments were simply ritual comfort. You light a bundle of dried herbs and wave the smoke around the room. It's supposed to cleanse the air, or at least mask the other smells. The injured man groans again. You offer him a carved talisman to grip. It's not magical, but it's something to hold. Sometimes healing meant stories. You tell one now about a jarl who fought with a broken arm and lived to fish again. It doesn't help, but it distracts. That counts. As the day fades, the patient drifts into a shallow sleep. You watch for signs: shivering redness, the wet sheen of fever. If it worsens, you'll try onions. If that fails, there's not much left to try. You close the shutters against the wind. Another child has a cough. A woman complains of aches. You refill the kettle and check your herbs again. There's always someone next in line. In Viking life, illness didn't knock. It let itself in and made itself comfortable. You step outside for air and immediately regret it. The stench hits before your second breath. Wet straw, human waste, spoiled fish. And something else you can't name, but desperately wish you could forget. Viking towns didn't just smell bad. They lived in their own fumes. The path to the latrine squelches beneath your feet. It's just a trench behind the longhouse lined with slippery stones and hidden hazards. There's no privacy, no seat, and very little dignity. You hold your tunic step carefully and try not to look directly at anything. Waste disposal was rudimentary at best. Most homes had no formal system, just pit ditches or slop buckets flung away, which often meant slightly downhill. In rain, everything mingled. In winter, it froze into grim sculptures. In summer, it festered. Nearby, someone tosses fish guts into a heap that's already steaming. That pile has been there for months, maybe years. Dogs paw at it. Birds circle above. You turn your head and gag quietly. A breeze carries the scent toward the center of the village where people are baking bread. Somehow, it mixes yeasty warmth and rotting brine. You try to focus on the bread. It helps. A little. Archaeologists studying Viking settlements have noted high concentrations of parasite eggs in soil, samples evidence of poor sanitation and dense human-animal living. Some argue that the Vikings didn't notice the smell that they were used to it. Others believe they noticed but had no better option. You pass by a fish-drying rack, rows of cod, stiff and sun-bleached. On good days, the smell is briny and clean. Today's not a good day. A few have fallen and lie half buried in mud. No one picks them up. Maybe they'll become pig feed. You step into a workshop hoping for relief. Instead, you find a vat of fermented fish paste used for seasoning. It bubbles slightly. You back out mumbling an excuse. Children run past barefoot and shrieking. One of them trips and lands in something unidentifiable. He gets up, wipes his hands on his tunic, and keeps running. You say nothing. There's no point. Behind the longhouse, someone is tanning leather. The hides soak in urine and ash to loosen hair. The mixture sits in a trough that hasn't been emptied since the snow melted. You can smell it from 3 houses away, probably 4. Yet somehow people thrive here. They joke, trade cook, raise children. Your senses scream, but your body adapts just like theirs. Maybe it's the fire smoke coating everything, or maybe your brain just gives up. Some researchers believe smells served as territorial markers, each home with its own olfactory signature. Others think that in communal living, nobody could afford to complain. Everyone smelled. That was the norm. Back inside the longhouse, the air is thick again, but familiar. You inhale deeply. Wool stew, smoke. Somehow, better. You sit near the hearth and scrub your hands with ashes not cleaner, just different. Viking life wasn't fragrant, but it was functional. And eventually even the worst smells fade, if not in truth, then in memory. The fire crackles low as night settles in, and you eye the sleeping platform with a mix of hope and dread. It's not that you aren't tired, you are. It's that sleep in a Viking longhouse isn't peace. It's proximity. You find your space a narrow strip of straw-stuffed bedding, wedged between a coughing uncle and a snoring piglet. The boards creak as you lie down the wood, warped from years of damp and use. You pull a woolen blanket over yourself, scratchy and slightly moist from the steam that never quite leaves the room. The hearth embers glow faintly. Smoke drifts upward, curling into the rafters. There's no chimney, just a hole in the roof, and depending on the wind, the smoke might go out or come right back in. Tonight it does both. Your eyes water gently. You tell yourself it's relaxing. Nearby someone murmurs in their sleep. A child coughs. The pig squeals, once then settles. There are no walls, no doors, just people and animals sharing heat and air. Breathing in rhythm, snoring in symphony. Vikings didn't have bedrooms. The entire family slept in the same open hall, often on shared benches or lofts. Straw-filled mattresses were common, sometimes lined with moss. Sheets unheard of. Pillows. Maybe a folded cloak if you were lucky. Privacy was a concept for kings. You shift slightly, trying not to poke the person beside you with your elbow. They respond by rolling into your side. You sigh. Comfort is negotiable. There's a small fire hazard element to the setup. Sparks from the hearth occasionally land on bedding. Everyone sleeps lightly because of it, especially those who've had to stomp out flames mid-dream. One corner of your blanket is already singed from a previous incident. You keep your boots close just in case. Some scholars speculate that Viking nights were restless affairs interrupted by coughing fits, animal noises, and rotating chores. Others believe the constant closeness created a stronger sense of communal safety, like a human battery pack. You close your eyes and try to drift. The straw pokes through the fabric, scratching your back. Someone farts loudly and unapologetically. You suppress a laugh and shift again this time, ending up half off the platform. A mouse scuttles overhead along the beams. You hear its tiny claws tick-ticking across the wood. It pauses. You open one eye. It stares back, then continues on its journey. You're not surprised. It lives here too. You pull the blanket tighter. It doesn't help. The air is thick, warm, but wet. Your breath feels heavier in your chest, like you're exhaling stew. Outside, the wind rattles the walls. The door flaps loosely on its leather hinge. Eventually, your body gives in, not to comfort, but to exhaustion. You don't sleep deeply, just enough to blur the edges of thought. It's not rest exactly, but it's what's available. And in the half-dream quiet of a Viking night, even a moment of stillness feels earned. Morning returns without ceremony, dragging a slate sky behind it. The snow crunches outside, and someone sneezes inside. But before chores begin again, there's a rare moment to breathe and listen. Because in the quiet drag of Viking winters, storytelling isn't just pastime, it's preservation. You sit cross-legged near the hearth mug of warm barley water in hand. Around you, others shuffle in, wrapped in cloaks and sleep. Someone tosses another log on the fire. The storyteller clears her throat not out of drama, but habit. The room stills, and the tale begins. No paper, no ink. Just memory and rhythm. The old woman's voice rises and falls like the tide as she recounts the saga of a one-eyed warrior who outwits a troll by pretending to be dead. The children lean forward. The adults nod knowingly. You smile. You've heard it before, but the delivery changes each time. Viking storytelling wasn't a hobby. It was an art form, a social glue, and sometimes a legal tool. Skalds and poets held status for a reason. They didn't just entertain, they remembered. Family lineages, legal decisions, heroic deeds all passed down orally, verse by carefully chosen verse. Today's tale is lighter part, cautionary part, absurd. It ends with a goat escaping into the sea. You laugh softly. The elder raises an eyebrow. Laughter is allowed, but not too loud. The walls aren't that thick. Outside, snow continues to fall. Inside, another voice picks up a different thread, a whispered recounting of how the stars were shaped by gods carving runes into the night. Is it true doesn't matter. It sounds true, and that's enough. Some historians suggest storytelling served as an early form of therapy, processing grief loss and fear through narrative. Others see it as entertainment layered with instruction. Still others argue that Vikings used tales like maps to navigate the unseen world. Gossip too flows like a quiet current beneath the official stories. Someone mentions a neighbor's odd cough. Someone else wonders about the trader who hasn't returned. Speculation fills the gaps between fact and folklore. You sip your drink and contribute a shrug. Later, someone recites a poem, a drot kvet, alliterative and precise. The rhythm is hypnotic, the structure complex. You don't catch every word, but the sound lulls you. There's comfort in repetition in the shapes words make when passed down over generations. A carved game board comes out Unfatafel, a Viking strategy game. Pieces move with calculated silence. Someone cheats, someone else lets them. The game fades into conversation, then back into another story. This one about a woman who grew wings during a thunderstorm. completely fabricated, completely compelling. The fire dwindles, the longhouse dims. Outside, the cold holds its breath. You lean back against the wall, heart warmed more by narrative than flame. These stories are blankets patched, frayed, but cherished. Not always factual, not always kind, but always there. And in a world of chores, ice, and endless fish stew that makes all the difference. Midday arrives with a knock, 3 sharp raps at the longhouse door. You answer expecting a neighbor with eggs or gossip. Instead, it's the local law speaker boots muddied and face pinched. Someone's in trouble, and trouble in Viking society wears many faces. You're summoned to the thing, a community gathering, where disputes are aired, justice served, and occasionally pigs bartered. It's not a court in the modern sense. There are no gavels, no robes, and certainly no order in the gallery. But judgments are made and consequences follow. The accused today, a man who stole a chicken, or maybe just borrowed it for too long. The owner is furious. The thief is defensive. The chicken is missing. You settle onto a cold stone beside other villagers. The law speaker stands in the center reciting from memory. Viking law was oral memorized in long poetic verses called gragas or gray goose laws. Forgetting a line could mean misjudging a life. Witnesses are called neighbors, mostly. One says the chicken was seen fleeing toward the river. Another swears it was a duck. Confusion mounts, but the process moves forward. Viking justice wasn't always about punishment. It was about restoration, balance, and public agreement. Compensation was common. Steal a sheep, pay its value in silver, insult someone's honor, throw a feast big enough to make them forget. But serious crimes, murder, repeated theft. Oath-breaking invited harsher outcomes. Some punishments involved exile or outlawry. Being declared Nithingr a social ghost meant no one could help you. No shelter, no food, not even a burial. Others were sentenced to trial by ordeal, grasping hot iron, or retrieving a stone from boiling water to prove innocence. Blisters were bad. Survival was luck. The chicken thief is lucky. He's fined 3 silver coins and required to gift the victim a week's worth of eggs if the chicken reappears. He agrees. Everyone nods. Justice Viking style. Historians remain divided on whether this system was fair or chaotic. Some praise its communal nature and flexibility. Others point to inconsistencies, biases, and loopholes that favored the rich or influential. A side dispute flares 2 women arguing over land boundaries. One pulls out a stick and draws the disputed plot in the dirt. Voices rise. The law speaker sighs and starts reciting another set of verses. You realize you've seen this exact argument 3 times this year, and yet the system works most of the time. Not because it's perfect, but because it belongs to the people. Everyone listens, everyone speaks, and everyone remembers what was said. Later back at the longhouse, you relay the story to a neighbor who missed it. You act out the indignant chicken owner, laughter bubbles. The justice may be simple, but the stories it leaves behind, enduring. You pass the spot where the thing was held. Footprints stamp the mud marking where judgment stood. No gallows, no jails. Just memory and agreement. And the faint hope that someone somewhere found that chicken. You stretch your arms, hoping for a moment of rest, but the longhouse doesn't recognize the concept. The fire needs feeding. The goats need herding. The tunic you mended last week is torn again. Viking life doesn't pause, it rotates, especially if you're a woman. You grab a wooden bucket and head outside. It's heavy before you even fill it. Water's a long walk down the hill, and the snow has started again, fat, wet flakes that cling to your sleeves like small complaints. You trudge on. The water must come. No one else will fetch it. Back inside, someone's yelling about a broken loom. You glance over to see a mother holding a spindle in one hand and a toddler in the other. She's spinning thread while stirring porridge with her foot, an acrobat of domestic duty. You nod in respect. Viking women ran the household. That wasn't an exaggeration, it was structure. While men hunted, farmed, or raided, women kept everything else breathing. They cooked, wove, cleaned, cured meat, raised children, managed livestock, and handled trade when needed. They even managed the family's money, silver rings weighed with care. Some argue this made Viking society unusually egalitarian for its time. Women could own land, divorce husbands, and inherit property. But others note that rights didn't erase the grind. Tasks were constant, invisible, and expected. You kneel by the hearth and rub wool with lye soap, hands red and raw. Your fingers move automatically now. You think about that story from last week, the one about a shield maiden who fought 10 men and never lost. You wonder if she ever had to scrape dried milk off a tunic while her baby cried and her soup boiled over. Outside, your neighbor repairs a fence. You see her hammering nails into the post with one hand while nursing a child strapped across her chest. Inside, another woman stacks firewood and sighs at the growing pile of winter shoes needing repair. No one complains aloud. It would take too long. The term husfreyja meant mistress of the house, and it wasn't a polite euphemism. It was command. If someone visited and found things disorganized, they didn't blame the absent father. They blamed her. Respect was earned through order, not ease. Some days you're proud, really proud. The household runs, the animals are fed, the food stores haven't rotted, and the children wear matching boots. Other days your back aches, your eyes burn, and you dream about lying down without being asked where the ladle went. There's no title, no parade. Just the soft satisfaction of knowing nothing collapsed on your watch. Historians continue to debate whether this labor structure empowered women or quietly exploited them. Perhaps it was both. Power in exchange for exhaustion. You pour yourself a cup of warm milk and sit beside the fire just for a minute. Someone asks where the yarn basket went. You lift it with your foot and pass it over. One more thing, you whisper. Always just one more thing. A loud clatter jolts you upright. Someone's dropped a shield in the snow. You peer outside expecting raiders, but it's just 3 boys wrestling over a rusted sword, play acting again. They shout about glory and plunder like the sagas taught them. You shake your head. Most Vikings never raided. The image of the horn-helmeted warrior is powerful, but mostly myth. Raiding was rare, dangerous, and deeply selective. Only a fraction of the population left home for violence and spoils. The rest stayed behind, tied to farms, families, and the infinitely less glamorous world of barley and buckets. Still, when raids happened, they left ripples. You remember the last one? A crew gone 3 weeks returned with tired eyes and barely enough silver to justify the blood. One man had a bandaged hand, another limped, a third didn't come back at all. No one mentioned him. Preparation for a raid was like preparing for a long, bad gamble. You packed dried fish-filled water skins, sharpened axes, and said goodbye without flair. There were no stirring speeches, just quiet nods and practical silence. Some left to escape debt. Others chased status. A few maybe liked it. You remember watching the ships leave low in the water with too many men? Sleek, yes, but exposed. The sea doesn't care about bravery. Storms took more lives than blades. Sometimes the waves returned empty vessels like driftwood full of ghosts. Historians continue to question how central raiding really was to Viking identity. Some believe it was a small but loud part of a broader trading culture. Others argue it was economic necessity turned ritual. Everyone agrees the romantic version, heroic charges, endless loot glory, unscathed, is mostly saga fiction. Raiding wasn't profitable for most. Villages defended themselves. Fortified towns bit back. Monasteries sometimes held more monks than gold, and dividing spoils messy business. Fights often broke out after the battles over silver pieces and stolen cloaks. You look at the boys again. One is pretending to fall dramatically. The others cheer. You wince slightly, remembering how real blood smells, how long it stains. You've seen the disappointment two young men returning not with treasure, but shame. Failed raids meant debt. Captains who misjudged tides. Crew lost to foreign prisons or worse. Glory didn't always follow the oars home. Back in the longhouse, a sword hangs above the hearth. Not yours, your grandfather's. He went once, came back, and never spoke of it again. It's not sharp anymore, just decorative weight. But people notice it when they visit. It says something. Even if that something is vague, you stir the stew, add more barley. The real strength of this house wasn't forged in battle. It was earned in firelight, in tasks that never made it into poems. A log shifts in the hearth. Sparks rise. You sit back down watching the boys duel with sticks. Maybe one day they'll sail. Maybe not. You hope not. Because behind every glory story is someone, often many, who stayed behind and made sure home was still standing. The wind picks up again, moaning through the cracks in the longhouse walls. You wrap your cloak tighter and glance toward the door. A thin frost has crept in overnight, curling like white moss along the threshold. It's beautiful and foreboding. Viking life didn't end with drama. It ended with cold, quiet inevitability. You check on the elder in the corner. He hasn't moved much today. His breathing is shallow, his hands tucked beneath a sheepskin. You pour him a sip of broth and gently lift his head. He swallows, but barely. You say nothing. So does he. You both know what's coming. Death visited often and in many disguises: exposure, infection, childbirth, famine, fire. Or just the slow unraveling of old age measured in smaller steps, quieter meals, and heavier blankets. There were no hospitals, no morphine, just time and memory. Outside, someone calls out another fence collapsed under snow. A child coughs in her sleep. The world doesn't stop, not even for endings. You walk past the fire, remembering how just last year, a neighbor froze outside trying to bring in a lost goat. They found him 2 mornings later, curled like a comma against a stone wall, clutching the animal to his chest. The goat survived. He didn't. Other deaths were less poetic. Accidents, feuds, bad clams, raids gone wrong, roofs caving, and simple infections that bloomed into fever. Some were buried in stone cairns. Others simply weren't. Snow erases footprints faster than grief. Historians continue to explore Viking attitudes toward death. Some point to elaborate ship burials and cremations as evidence of reverence and ritual. Others argue those were reserved for the elite, while most met quieter ends wrapped in cloth, placed in earth, remembered in fragments. The sagas speak of Valhalla, of glorious deaths in battle, but in these walls death is quieter. It's the silence after a story ends mid-sentence. It's the sudden extra portion of stew. It's someone's comb still hanging by the fire untouched for days. You sit back down and help a child patch a hole in her glove. Her fingers are small and quick. She doesn't ask where the old man is, not yet. Maybe she knows. Maybe she doesn't need to. Later, you stoke the fire. The longhouse hums with quiet tasks, mending, stirring, whispering. The wind rattles again, but no one reacts. It always rattles. Life here is tough, yes, but resilient. You don't fear death exactly. You just respect its timing. There are potatoes still to store a cloak, to finish a story someone wanted to hear again. You glance at the elder one more time. His eyes are closed. His chest rises, faintly. Still here for now. You dip your hands into the water basin. Cold, sharp, awake. Life in the north is a rhythm of frost and fire, of smoke and breath. Some days are harder than others, but all of them in their rough, quiet way are earned. And while the cold claimed many, it was fire persistent, ordinary, elemental that carried life forward. Not just any fire, but the kind watched stirred and guarded with quiet reverence. The hearth is low and glowing. Around it, the timber ribs of a Viking longhouse lean in like silent conspirators. You crouch by the fire as the smoke curls upward through a smoke hole in the roof. No chimneys here, just a ghostly trail threading its way into the sky. It smells of peat pine and a little charred milk. Someone left the porridge too long. Again. Behind you, the matriarch moves with practiced ease. She doesn't just tend the fire, she commands it. In many Viking homes, the woman of the house ruled this inner sanctum. The hearth was the heart of the household. From it came food, warmth, light, and social life. And whoever controlled that, well, they didn't just stir stew, they shaped the rhythms of everyone's day. Historians agree that in Norse culture, women held considerable sway over the domestic sphere. The wife, or husfreyja, literally lady of the house, had authority over servants' resources and rituals. She was also keeper of the family's keys, symbolic and literal. Keys dangled from her belt not only to unlock storerooms, but to signal her command of the household economy. Quaint. Not quite. Picture this: a frigid winter evening, crops stored but dwindling, and a dozen hungry mouths to feed. The matriarch decided when to serve salted fish, or when to stretch the barley. She could make or break a season with a single ladle of broth. One wrong calculation, and her family might go from respected to desperate in a matter of weeks. And yet, there's debate. Some scholars argue that this power was soft symbolic, more ceremonial than functional. Others point to sagas where women wielded influence with startling boldness, dispensing advice, commanding household servants, even punishing disobedient kin. The fire then may have burned brighter than the records let on. A quirky fact: Viking women were sometimes buried with fire-starting tools. Tinderboxes, flint and steel nestled beside them in the earth, as if to say, even in death, she'll keep the fire going. Some graves even include cooking gear and keys reinforcing the idea that their role didn't end with life. You shift your gaze to the iron pot above the coals, the soup bubbles gently scenting the air with onion, wild herbs, and something meaty seal. Maybe the matriarch tastes with a carved wooden spoon, nods, approved. The children wait for her signal. Only when she gives it does the meal begin. You start to see it now, not as quaint, but strategic. A place where alliances were forged over roasted roots. A space where control of the kitchen meant control of the calendar, the economy, and the social ladder. The fire crackles. The woman stokes it not just with kindling, but with command. The light from the hearth fades as you step into a colder room, one where marriage is less about love and more about livestock. In Viking society, tying the knot involved fewer flowers and more iron rings, fat dowries, and the occasional axe. You kneel at the edge of a wooden bench, watching a young couple across the room. They're not making googly eyes. They're flanked by elders counting silver arm rings and murmuring over land claims. The girl's mother adjusts the bride's wimple. The father carves an oath stick. Romance barely a glimmer, but every glance and gesture feels like a chess move. Marriage in Viking culture was transactional, strategic, and surprisingly negotiable for women. Girls didn't just get married off like extra sheep. Families haggled, plotted, and calculated. A strong alliance through marriage could mean protection, trade routes, or a boost in social standing. Dowries were critical: land, livestock, even furniture. And the woman retained legal control of her dowry after marriage, a subtle but potent tool of independence. Here's the odd twist: Viking women could initiate divorce, and not quietly. If her husband struck her, failed to provide, or simply didn't satisfy, she could walk away. Literally. All she had to do was declare the separation in front of witnesses, often at the household threshold. "I divorce you," she'd announce sometimes with sharp words and sharper knives. His friends would awkwardly pretend not to hear. Hers would help pack the goat cheese. Still, some scholars argue these freedoms were more myth than fact. Most surviving laws were written by men, and sagas, though vivid, are semi-fictional. It's unclear how many women truly had the social muscle to divorce without repercussion. Others point out that these rights, while impressive compared to contemporary Europe, were still embedded in a patriarchal framework. A quirky tale persists of a woman named the Deep-Minded. After her husband's death, she arranged marriages for her grandchildren, managed fleets, and wielded more power than many male chieftains. She even had her own burial mound. Legend, perhaps. But Icelandic sagas treat her as a full-on matriarch. And if it sounds like she ruled the clan, well, maybe she did. You glance back at the wedding scene. The couple now shares a ceremonial drink, possibly mead, possibly regret. The families clasp hands and a sheep bleats in the distance. Somewhere a ledger is being updated. It's easy to laugh at the idea of love by ledger, but think about it in a world of fragile alliances and seafaring danger. Emotional passion might seem frivolous. A stable marriage wasn't about kisses. It was about keys to the storehouse, mutual defense pacts, and ensuring the winter grain lasted until April. You shift on the bench and feel the worn groove left by generations of similar negotiations. In that groove, you sense a quiet strength. Viking women didn't wear crowns, but they brokered the deals behind them, and sometimes walking away from a bad deal was the boldest act of power. The ring, the dowry, the doorframe silent witnesses to a woman's calculated choice. The fire's warmth fades behind you as you step outside into frost-crisp fields where hooves crunch over frozen mud and breath billows like steam from the mouths of cattle. There are no warriors here, no longships on the horizon, just a woman with a wooden rake, a crooked posture, and a gaze sharp enough to herd clouds. This is her farm now. When Viking men went raiding or trading, women didn't just wait. They worked relentlessly, inventively, and with an authority that would surprise modern assumptions. The entire farm became her kingdom, and every wheelbarrow butter churn and bag of barley reported to her. You watch her direct the thralls' enslaved workers, and sometimes extended kin toward the stables. She's not shouting, just pointing. The goats obey. The haystack obeys. Even the tax collector, when he shows up, looks sheepish. She's the one tallying accounts, organizing seed storage, and negotiating with neighboring farms. There's no man here, and none is missed. Viking law codes mention this arrangement often. When a husband went abroad, the wife took legal and economic control of the estate. If he died or disappeared, both common, she could continue managing the land hire labor and handle disputes. In essence, she was both farmer and CEO. But how real was this power? Some historians argue that it was limited to times of absence, that once a man returned, her authority evaporated. Others believe that these periods of solo leadership created enduring skills and influence, shaping how communities viewed capable women. The records are thin, and interpretations vary like Icelandic weather. One thing's certain, her day was grueling. She'd rise before dawn to check livestock delegate to thralls, then manage spinning, weaving, dairying, and bookkeeping, all before supper. No hour was idle. Even prayers were multitasked. You notice her now, at the pigsty, bartering with a neighbor over breeding rights for a prize sow. It's not exactly glamorous. But there's something quietly noble about her mud-spattered boots and calloused hands. This is a woman who counts time not by months, but by lambing's harvests, and how many loaves a bushel of rye yields. A quirky footnote. Some Viking women left runestones praising their own farm management. These rare inscriptions boast of efficient grain production, orderly households, and even hiring choices. It's domestic life, as legacy not poetry, but inventory. Their pride wasn't in conquest, it was in competence. And then there's the saga of Aud the Deep-Minded Yes Again. After leading her people across the sea, she built farms in Iceland, allotted land to her followers, and freed her slaves. When she died, they buried her standing upright in a mound by the sea so she could keep watch. Even in legend, the matriarch does not sit. You look back at the farm. Children feed chickens. Someone sings a lullaby to a goat. And at the center of it all, the woman stirs a pot with one hand, while measuring grain with the other. She's not filling a gap while men are gone. She's running an empire. The wind shifts, carrying the faint scent of lanolin and fermented dye. You follow the smell to a lean-to, where wool hangs in bunches dripping purple ochre and woad blue. Inside, a woman sits at her loom, her shuttle dancing between warp threads like a bird flitting through reeds. The rhythm is slow, hypnotic, almost musical. You're not in a mere weaving hut. You're in a factory, a bank, a ledger of reputations. In Viking society, textile work wasn't just a domestic chore, it was a cornerstone of the economy. Women controlled every step from shearing sheep to carding wool, spinning thread, dyeing, weaving, and finally trading the finished cloth. And cloth wasn't merely for clothing, it was currency, literally. In places where coinage was scarce woven fabric, especially sailcloth and fine linen, became a key medium of exchange. The woman at the loom doesn't break her rhythm. She's crafting a wall hanging rich with geometric patterns. Each line of thread might represent a future debt, paid a dowry enhanced, or a ship fitted with sails. Her hands move with practiced grace, but behind the elegance lies serious economic clout. Archaeological finds across Scandinavia reveal the tools of this trade spindle whirl's loom, Waite's bone combs often buried with women. Some were elaborately decorated, suggesting not just ownership, but status. Scholars continue to debate whether these women operated as individual producers or as part of wider trade networks. The evidence is patchy, but one thing is clear: their labor fueled much more than just family wardrobes. One curious discovery comes from Oseberg, Norway, where a richly buried woman was entombed with a collection of high-end textiles, some from far-off lands. Whether she wove them or commissioned them is unclear, but her presence signals textile wealth as a form of prestige, perhaps rivaling gold or weaponry. You crouch near a basket of dyed wool and run your fingers through it. It's surprisingly soft. The woman glances at you and nods not unkindly, but with the distracted air of someone mid-calculation. She's counting warp threads and contemplating market values, all while keeping toddlers from climbing into the dye vat. This isn't just busy work, it's influence spun into fabric. Wives of chieftains often managed entire weaving operations, overseeing servant labor and ensuring high-quality exports. Some of the fabric ended up as diplomatic gifts. Others were stitched into burial cloaks or sailcloth, essential tools of Viking mobility and warfare. There's a paradox here. These women didn't ride into battle, but they wove the sails that carried raiders across seas. They weren't kings, but they made the tapestries that immortalized kings' deeds. Power doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears wool. Behind you, the loom creaks again. A child enters handing the weaver a spindle. She smiles, tucks it into her apron, and resumes her rhythm. Every thread she weaves hums with unseen consequence, and every fabric she finishes might just steer a ship. Step away from the looms, and the scent of lanolin fades, replaced now by smoke earth and something more elusive. You find yourself at the edge of a circle marked not by stones, but by silence. A woman stands at the center, draped in layers of fur and feather staff, in hand eyes closed. She is not praying, she is listening. This is the vulva, the Viking seeress. She is not a housewife nor a weaver. She's something else entirely. Both feared and revered, the vulva occupied a space outside normal social categories. She wandered, summoned, intoned. Her staff was both walking stick and wand, her cloak a ritual garment laced with animal bones, bronze discs, and dyed wool. You'd be forgiven for mistaking her for a wild thing until the chieftain kneels to hear her speak. Velur plural performed a ritual called Seder, a kind of Norse shamanism. It often involves singing spells known as Galder and inducing trance states to see distant or future events. Sometimes they used hallucinogens, henbane, fly, agaric, or sleep deprivation. Sometimes it was merely the weight of expectation that brought visions to light. Either way, their predictions could shape war decisions, trade routes, or who a chieftain trusted or feared. And they weren't always welcome. The vulva's power came with unease. Many were itinerant, arriving in villages with great ceremony, but never staying long. Some scholars suggest this tension between reverence and exclusion made the vulva both central and peripheral to Viking society. Others argue they were honored elders woven deeply into ritual life. There's no consensus, just bones, tools, and sagas. In one account, a seeress is served a special porridge with butter and animal hearts, an offering meant to open the spiritual gate. As she eats, the villagers hold their breath. When she finally speaks, her words fall like frost, each phrase interpreted and debated for weeks. You inch closer to the vulva, now careful not to step over any hidden boundary. She begins to chant. It's not melodic, it's raw, more like the wind catching a tree's breath. Around her neck dangles a Thor's hammer, but in her voice you hear something older than gods. An odd detail: men could practice Seder too, but at great cost. It was considered ergi, a term denoting unmanliness or shame. Odin himself was mocked for dabbling in it, even as he sought wisdom from women who knew more. Power, it seems, had gendered rules even in magic. You glance back toward the farmsteads where life runs by sun and sowing. Here in this sacred circle, time behaves differently. Days do not pass, they ripple. The vulva opens her eyes. She says nothing, but turns her staff toward you, not as a threat, as an invitation. The story suggests she's both outsider and oracle, neither wife nor widow. Just a woman with one foot in this world and one softly stepping beyond it. Her staff taps the ground. The vision begins. The trance fades, and with it the ethereal hum of prophecy. You return to firmer ground, clay floors, wooden beams, the clatter of spoons against bowls. In a modest hall lit by rushlights, another woman counts dried fish checks, jars of barley, and smooths wax seals on small amphorae. No fur cloak, no chance. Just calm efficiency and the gentle creak of a well-run household. She is not a mystic. She is the bookkeeper of everyday survival. While Viking men might chase silver overseas, it was women who ensured every last fish head and oat kernel served a purpose. They ran the household economy like quiet tyrants, part steward, part logistician, part chef. One eye on the larder, the other on the neighbor's gossip. You step aside as she brushes past, holding a wooden tally stick etched with careful notches. She's not just planning meals. She's managing the family's entire microeconomy, supplies, storage preparation, trade preservation, and even what could be spared for gifts or barter. In Viking society, where wealth was often stored in consumables, grain meat, textiles, mead, her hand decided what stayed, what went, and what quietly vanished before winter. Historians agree that the household was not a passive space. It was the backbone of Viking society. Women who ran it well gained reputation, and sometimes subtle political power. A mismanaged home could lead to starvation debt or social disgrace. But here's where the threads tangle. Some scholars argue that while women had these responsibilities, they lacked recognition. They were expected to keep everything running, but rarely credited unless things fell apart. You glance around. Every item in the room tells a story of control. The hanging bundles of herbs organized by use and season. The tanned fish skins kept for boots or trade. The fermentation crocks in the corner burbling with mead or sour milk. She checks them like a captain, inspects sails not lovingly, but thoroughly. Precision matters. A quirky glimpse into this dynamic appears in the sagas where women often exchange goods on behalf of their households, swapping cheese for iron tools, flax for amber beads. Some even managed small trade ventures or invested their dowries into shipping expeditions. But official records remain frustratingly sparse. Were these activities exceptions or everyday practice? Surviving accounts are ambiguous. Back in the room, the woman begins directing her children, her servants, even the dog who guards the smokehouse. It's not loud, no one yells, but things happen. The stew pot is stirred at the right time. The baby is quieted with a chew root. A visiting cousin is handed a jar of preserved herring strategic hospitality. She finally sits only to reach for another set of tally sticks. You notice that she wears a belt lined with keys not for decoration. Each one unlocks something different: the food chest, the storeroom, the linen coffer. Together they jingle like a lullaby of responsibility. Or maybe a crown with teeth. She doesn't call herself powerful, but she never asks permission either. Step now into silence, damp earth, a hollow thud as turf is lifted. Before you lies a Viking burial site, strangely domestic and faintly regal. Not a warrior's resting place, but a woman's. Yet, instead of rosaries or relics, the grave holds keys. Dozens of them nestled in bronze bowls beside weaving tools, fire strikers, and a knife with an antler hilt. No swords, no armor. And yet, unmistakable authority. In Viking Age graves, the goods buried with the dead speak volumes. For women, these often included domestic symbols, keys for authority, spindle whorls for labor, brooches for status. But some graves especially, a few richly appointed ones, tell a murkier, more intriguing story. Was she a noble woman, a ritual leader, a war widow, or something we no longer have a name for? One such burial found in Oseberg, Norway, stunned archaeologists. 2 women lay in a lavish ship grave surrounded by imported silks, carved sleighs, and animal remains. One was clearly elderly. The other's role remains debated. Priestess, queen, sorceress. The grave goods include a staff-like object. Some say was magical, others insist was mundane. There is no scholarly consensus. You kneel beside a simpler grave, now less lavish, but no less revealing. Among the bones is a belt buckle shaped like a house. Beneath it, an iron key, a small whetstone, and a pair of shears. This woman might have fed 30 people, raised 7, and mended the clothes of everyone who ever wronged her. Her memorial is not grand, but it is precise. A curious pattern emerges. Women buried with keys often held high domestic authority. Some graves contain weighing scales or bead-making tools, suggesting involvement in trade. Others feature weapons, though rarely in battle-ready poses. Scholars debate whether these items were ceremonial, symbolic, or practical. Did they fight, or did they wield influence another way? And what of the warrior graves? One in Birka, Sweden, long assumed to be a male warrior, was revealed by DNA analysis to be female. She was interred with a sword, arrows, and a pair of war horses. For years, this discovery was dismissed or explained away, surely a mistake or symbolic burial. But the bones are clear. She was a woman. The rest is conjecture. Even more enigmatic are graves of women with unusual combinations of items, both domestic and mystical. A weaving comb beside a ravenclaw pendant, a butter churn paired with a miniature Thor's hammer. What do these pairings mean? Researchers continue to puzzle it out, but the blend of the sacred and mundane feels intentional. You glance around the burial site. The mist curls in low spirals. A few upright stones still mark graves that once shaped communities. These women were not just remembered, they were curated. Not erased, but encrypted. Their lives stored in symbols waiting to be decoded. And what are graves really but arguments about legacy? The wind stirs. You step away carefully. And behind you, the earth holds its secrets a little tighter. The wind carries whispers now, not from the dead, but from the living. You're seated near a hearth again, but this one crackles with gossip instead of firewood. A woman leans in close to another hands busy with embroidery, voices low and calculated. This isn't idle chatter. This is currency. In Viking society, reputation was everything. It determined who got invited to feasts, whose marriage offers were accepted, and who could rely on allies in a feud, and the guardians of that invisible bank, women. You shift slightly on the bench as a girl drops off a clay jug of mead and leans in eager to hear the latest tale of who insulted whom, which couple might be splitting, and what so-and-so said about the chieftain's boots. But behind every juicy detail is a calculation. Who gains, who loses, which clan will be stronger when the news finally spreads. This wasn't mindless rumor-mongering, it was social strategy. Viking women were often the managers of a household's image part, publicist, part negotiator. They smoothed over disputes, kindled alliances with kind words or cutting ones, and knew precisely when silence said more than speech. One famous saga tells of Hallgerdur, a noble woman known as much for her sharp tongue as her beauty. When insulted, she didn't raise a sword. She whispered, she stirred, and soon entire family feuds bloomed from the seeds she sowed with a single sentence. Her husband, a stoic warrior, warned her not to provoke violence. She smiled and did it anyway. Their enemies bled. She embroidered. Some historians argue that these women wielded a type of soft power, a term that only sounds gentle. In truth, controlling the flow of information, emotion, and rumor could sway political outcomes just as forcefully as a battle axe. Others caution against romanticizing it. There's little direct record of women in Viking councils or assemblies. Was this whispering power respected or merely tolerated? A quirky artifact from Gotland offers a glimpse. A brooch engraved with runes mentions a woman named Asa, praised not for her weaving or children, but for clever words that turned foes to kin. It's unclear who wrote it or why, but it suggests that some women's reputations were built not just on fertility or craft, but on diplomacy of the tongue. In your lap now rests a woven blanket, the pattern dense with knots and swirls. A woman beside you fingers the edge, muttering a name, then a second pairing them, as though testing the strength of the weave. She's matchmaking, or predicting, or steering fate softly and precisely. You begin to understand in this world, information is power, and the ones who handle it delicately like thread through a needle can bind families, ruin reputations, or broker peace with just a raised brow. The fire pops. Someone laughs. And across the room, a rival glances up, sensing her name on someone else's lips. From whispered alliances to battle-worn legends, you now step into a different kind of storm. The clatter of weapons, the hiss of steel sliding free from leather. A woman stands in a clearing, not behind a loom or hearth, but before a target axe in hand. She swings not tentatively, but with the practiced rhythm of someone who knows how to aim for the ribs. Meet the shield maiden part, legend part, enigma. Viking sagas are full of women who fight Brynhild Hervor Lagertha. They ride into battle, duel rivals, and sometimes lead armies. These stories aren't gentle bedtime tales. They're blood-soaked epics. But here's the tension. Were these shield maidens historical figures, or just literary flair? Did Viking women really fight, or are these characters symbolic fantasies woven from fear, admiration, or something in between? The archaeological evidence is complicated. Take the Burka grave, the one we mentioned before. Found in Sweden, this richly furnished burial contained weapons, gaming pieces, and war horses. Initially assumed male, later DNA testing revealed the warrior was female. Game changer. Some say yes, proof that women held martial roles. Others argue it could have been a ceremonial burial or an unusual exception. The debate, like most Viking arguments, refuses to settle. Still, Viking women trained. We know this from law codes, which include injury clauses for fights between women, and from training tools found in domestic settings. Sword practice wasn't just for boys, and neither was vengeance. If a family member was killed, women were expected, sometimes required, to seek retribution. You watch as the woman in the clearing plants her feet and hurls the axe. It thuds into the target with a satisfying crack. She nods once, not in celebration, but confirmation. It's skill, not luck. A quirky legend about Lagertha claims she once disguised herself as a man to fight alongside Ragnar Lodbrok, later revealing her identity with dramatic flair. He was so impressed, he proposed marriage. She accepted, then stabbed him later, figuratively in the heart. They divorced. Some scholars think she was based on a real figure. Others see her as a narrative device to explore gender inversion and power. But here's the subtle twist. Even if most Viking women didn't fight, the idea that they could was powerful. Sagas use these figures to challenge and explore the limits of gender roles, and their stories endured, passed down with the same reverence as those of kings and conquerors. You step back as another woman tries her swing, less accurate, more enthusiastic. There's laughter. Training here isn't rigid, it's communal. You sense camaraderie, not military formation, but it still echoes with purpose. Behind every sword in these tales, there's a woman who knew the stakes. Not just in battle, but in how the world saw her. She may not have led raids, but she could defend her home, avenge her kin, or at least terrify a would-be suitor into thinking twice. And really, what's more Viking than that? The clang of axes fades as you wander into a quieter structure, part meeting hall, part archive. Here, justice isn't screamed from horseback. It's whispered in clauses and carved into stone. A woman stands near a wooden bench, her fingers tracing the edges of a rune-inscribed law tablet. She's not here to plead. She's here to understand her rights. Because Viking women had them, sort of. In a time when many medieval societies denied women legal identity beyond their husbands, Norse law offered surprising allowances. Women could own property, inherit land, and even testify in court under certain conditions. A widow could manage estates. A daughter could receive a share of the inheritance. And a wife could, as you've heard, initiate divorce. It wasn't utopia, but it was pragmatic. You watch her settle a dispute with a neighbor. It's about grazing rights, who gets the upper meadow when the snow thaws first. No shouting. Just 2 carved sticks and a local lawman reciting precedents from memory. It's like a chess game wrapped in goatskin. Scholars agree that Norse women had more legal protection than their counterparts in Anglo-Saxon England or Frankish Gaul. But here comes the wrinkle: were those rights consistently upheld? Some historians argue the laws existed more in theory than practice, enforced when convenient, overlooked when power shifted. Others point to the Icelandic Althing, where legal cases brought by or on behalf of women were recorded and debated with some regularity. A quirky legal tidbit: if a man accused a woman of witchcraft without evidence, he could be outlawed. Defamation wasn't taken lightly. especially if it endangered a woman's reputation or family alliances. Another rule stated that if a woman's husband was killed unlawfully, she had the right to pursue blood vengeance or compensation herself. And then there's the marriage contract. These weren't vague promises. They were detailed agreements outlining dowry terms, property divisions, and expectations for behavior. Women often entered marriages with more clarity and arguably more leverage than many modern prenups. The document might include livestock numbers, textile contributions, or who got the bronze kettle in case of separation. The woman in the hall now steps outside into the fading light. A younger girl trails behind her asking questions. What if he refuses to pay? What if the cow dies before winter? What if he lies? The older woman smiles and hands her a small bone token, etched with tally marks. Then you count. Always count. You look back at the law hall. Its pillars are rough-hewn, the roof low and smoky. But it holds something vital, a shared understanding of boundaries. And even if uneven, those boundaries included women in ways far ahead of their time. Power didn't always wear a sword. Sometimes it wore a ledger and waited patiently in line. And if the law failed, well, that's when the sagas get interesting. A softer path now, no courts, no axes. Just a narrow trail winding between farmsteads dotted with young voices and dusty footprints. A boy in a wool tunic waves goodbye, handed a satchel of dried fish and a carved wooden toy. His mother watches from the gate eyes, scanning the horizon. He isn't running away. He's being fostered. In Viking society, fostering wasn't an act of desperation. It was diplomacy. You walk alongside the woman as she lingers by the fence, her face unreadable. She's just handed her child to another household, not out of need, but strategy. Children sent to foster families often became part of complex networks of trust obligation and future alliances. Raising another family's child meant future favors, cemented loyalty, and social glue in a landscape where kinship wasn't just blood, it was barter, and women orchestrated it all. You arrive at another homestead, where the boy is greeted not as an outsider, but as a small, sticky ambassador. The foster mother crouches to adjust his belt, offering him a wooden cup of milk. This home might be stricter or softer, richer or poorer, but either way, it's chosen, deliberately, often across clans. Historians note that this practice was widespread in Norse culture, especially among the elite. Fostering bonded families in ways no legal document could. And while men might shake hands over the deal, women usually managed the emotional logistics, negotiating care, settling disputes, and keeping the peace when things frayed. Still, there's debate. Was this custom primarily for practical childcare or political weaving? Some scholars argue it was both blurring domestic labor with quiet diplomacy. Others question how much agency women had in choosing foster placements. The sagas often skip that part. But what they do show is women navigating these bonds with surprising deftness. A quirky tale. One saga describes a woman named Thorgerd, who fostered a boy destined to become a poet. When war threatened, she used her influence to keep him from being dragged into blood feuds, arguing that his talent was worth more than vengeance. He survived. His verses didn't mention her, but she may have saved more than one legacy that day. Back on the trail, the foster boy is already playing with another child, his new sibling for a season. The two squabble over a stick, then collapse in giggles. Inside, the foster mother arranges extra bedding. It smells faintly of sheep and thyme. Meanwhile, the birth mother walks home alone, her pace unhurried. She's done this before. There's trust, there's risk. But in this exchange lies power, not overt, but enduring. Because to send a child is to say, I believe in our bond enough to place my future in your hands, and to receive one. That's an even louder answer. Twilight gathers, softening the fields into shadow. You follow flickering torchlight toward a clearing encircled with stones. A group of women move deliberately scattering herbs, singing under their breath, eyes lifted toward the moon. There are no temples here, no altars, just rhythm memory and smoke. This is sacred space, and these are its keepers. In Norse paganism, religious rituals were woven through daily life, births, marriages, harvests, and funerals, all marked with offerings and invocations. But many of these rites didn't happen in great halls or under priestly oversight. They happened in kitchens at grave sites or beside ancient trees, and it was often women, mothers, grandmothers, midwives who conducted them. You pause as one woman pours milk into a carved wooden bowl, then places it on a stone, an offering not to a singular god, but perhaps to land spirits' ancestors, or something older still. The distinctions blur. Norse spirituality wasn't codified like Roman religion or monotheistic faiths. It was lived, embodied, whispered more than preached, and in that liminal realm, women held sway. Historical texts like the Poetic Edda mention female ritualists often called Gidja or Hlutverk terms that suggest spiritual roles though their exact duties remain foggy. In some households, the matriarch served as the de facto priestess leading seasonal rites and ancestral offerings. In others, traveling seeresses or wise women performed more formal ceremonies. The line between magic and worship healer and prophet was often a thread pulled by women, but scholars continue to debate just how central women were to Norse religious life. Some argue that these roles were respected, embedded into the social structure. Others claim they were marginal, tolerated perhaps, but not institutionalized. The truth likely lies between torchlight and shadow. A curious artifact adds to the mystery in Denmark. Archaeologists unearthed a grave containing a silver bowl engraved with ritual symbols and a small bundle of herbs believed to be yarrow and mugwort. The woman buried there was surrounded by tools both domestic and ceremonial, suggesting a role that defied simple categorization. You watch now as the women lift their arms in unison, not dramatic, not performative, just practiced. They know the rhythm, a lullaby for the land itself. The younger girls sprinkle grain into the soil, imitating their mothers. An older woman adjusts a girl's shawl, then taps her gently on the shoulder to join the chant. It's not teaching, it's inheritance. Religion here isn't dogma, it's woven into the seasons, the soil, the quiet moments between chores. The sacred isn't set apart from daily life. It is daily life. As the ritual closes, the women extinguish the torches with handfuls of damp moss. The clearing dims. The smell of herbs lingers, mixing with loam and wood smoke. Baby cries softly in the distance, then quiets. You realize, stepping back into the dusk, that these women may not have shaped doctrine or built temples, but they shaped memory, belief, continuity. And in that, they shape something divine. Dawn breaks cool and pale, and you find yourself walking beside a woman dressed in heavy wool, her fingers wrapped tightly around a key ring. Her eyes are steady, her chin high. She is a widow, but not in mourning clothes. Her pace is brisk, her errands are many. In Viking society, widowhood was no final curtain. It was, for some, a second act. You pause as she enters a small outbuilding, her former husband's workshop, now hers by inheritance. She examines the tools, nods to a servant, and selects a ledger from a shelf. No hesitation, no ceremony. The land is hers now, the livestock, the debts, the decisions. Under Norse law, a widow could inherit her husband's property and manage it independently. She didn't have to remarry unless she chose to. In fact, many didn't, especially if their social status and wealth gave them security. Others remarried quickly, sealing new alliances or restoring labor to a farm suddenly short one pair of strong hands. But this wasn't one size fits all. Scholars still debate how much practical freedom widowhood offered. Some argue it was a brief window of autonomy before family pressure or economic necessity nudged a woman back into marriage. Others believe widows often leveraged their new power to protect sons, arrange new marriages for daughters, or even become patrons of local trade. You notice this widow instructing her son, a boy of maybe 10, to record grain deliveries in the tally book. She's teaching him the system, but make no mistake, she's still the boss. There's no elder uncle stepping in, no brother taking over. She's expected to manage the estate until her heir is grown, and she appears quite content with that arrangement. A quirky burial site in Iceland adds texture to this role. It held a woman buried with household key scales for weighing silver, and 2 carved gaming pieces, symbols of controlled judgment and, perhaps, strategy. She wasn't a wife. The runes described her simply as holder of the hall, a title in its own right. But not all widowhoods were empowering. Some women found themselves forced to remarry for survival. Others lost legal claims if their husband died intestate. Family alliances could fray without a male figurehead, and some widows were absorbed back into their birth families, sometimes willingly, sometimes not. Back outside, the woman trades a sealed jar of butter for a stack of firewood. She offers no apology, no discount. Her word is enough. No one questions her price. And yet her authority is quiet. It's in the way others pause when she speaks, in how they mimic her tone when describing boundaries, disputes, or rainfall. You realize she isn't just living her late husband's legacy. She's shaping her own. She closes the workshop behind her and ties the keyring to her belt. If grief lingers, it's kept private. What the world sees is a woman who now answers only to herself, and maybe the weather. You follow her footsteps to the edge of the market, a scattered patch of cloth. Stalls carved wooden tables and baskets brimming with turnips, beads, smoked fish, and dyed wool. No one shouts. There are no painted signs. But every exchange hums with quiet calculation. And many of the hands exchanging goods, feminine. Viking women were not just homemakers. They were craftswomen, traders, and shapers of subtle commerce. You stop beside a woman selling beads, amber glass, and jet threaded on thin twine and arranged in color-coded rows. Her fingers are ink-stained and stained from soot. She crafted them herself using sand heat and patience. They're not just pretty, they're portable wealth. Bead making was one of several specialized trades Viking women practiced. Others included weaving pottery, herbal medicine, leatherwork, and brewing. These were not idle hobbies. They were income, influence, insurance against uncertainty. Goods could be bartered locally or sold during seasonal markets that drew travelers from distant fjords and foreign ships. And yet, these women rarely appear in formal records. No merchant guilds, no official titles. But their handiwork surfaces everywhere, from York to Kiev, Riga to Dublin. Archaeologists have uncovered stalls, storage sheds, and hoards containing goods consistent with female-produced wares. It's the invisible economy, written not in laws, but in linen and lard. One quirky detail spindle whorls found across Scandinavia often bear decorative marks. Some believe they were makers' signatures, tiny branding gestures by women who knew the value of a recognizable product. If true, it suggests something like proto-branding, long before logos and slogans. Still, scholars debate whether Viking women had the freedom to operate as independent merchants. Some say yes, especially widows or wives of traders. Others suggest their trade was limited to household surplus, bartered quietly rather than boldly. The sagas, as usual, are ambiguous, featuring women who own ships or manage shipments, but rarely detailing the mundane realities of market exchange. Back in the stall, the bead seller hands a woven pouch to a man in exchange for 2 bolts of undyed wool. She doesn't haggle, she doesn't smile. The deal is done. Beside her, a younger girl tends a basket of goat's cheese, counting customers with furtive glances. She watches her mother's every movement, absorbing the unspoken language of supply demand and seasonal timing. Summer means berries, winter means dried fish, and always the whisper of risk. You stroll past other stalls, a woman selling fermented birch sap, another stitching leather shoes, one seated on a mat, carding raw fleece into roving thread. Each has her own rhythm. Each has her own value. You realize this marketplace isn't chaotic. It's calibrated. Women don't need ledgers here. They count in muscle memory and reputation. Their names may not echo in sagas, but their work lingers on fingers and fibers and taste. You glance back at the bead stall. The sun glints off amber, and behind it, a woman wraps the coin cord around her wrist, quietly rich in a world that barely saw her. The market sounds dissolve as you climb a low rise behind the village where grass grows over ancient stones and silence hangs heavier than fog. There's no monument here, just a weathered bench, a fading trail, and a woman sitting beneath a crooked tree. She's not weaving or bartering or tending sheep. She's telling a story. To no one, to everyone. This is the Viking woman's final domain memory. She speaks softly, naming her great-grandmother's name, then her own daughter's. She recites birth storms, quarrels, and reconciliations, not as dry facts, but as threads in a tapestry only she knows how to read. Her voice is part lullaby, part ledger. Every name carries weight. Every pause is reverence. In a world without widespread literacy, women were often the vessels of lineage. They remembered who married whom, who inherited what, and who broke which truce at that one feast when the mead ran out too soon. They passed down not just stories, but social memory boundaries, alliances, feuds, favors owed. Historians recognize that this oral tradition, especially among women, was critical to Viking social structure. Estates were passed through memory as much as deed. Disputes were resolved with recalled genealogy. And reputations lived or died by how someone was remembered and who was doing the remembering. Some scholars argue this made women the true architects of legacy. Others caution that their influence, while real, remained unacknowledged, recorded in silence, preserved in habits, never in ink. A quirky discovery in Greenland offers an echo of this role. In a remote farmstead, archaeologists found a carved wooden spindle inscribed with a single line in runes. For the daughter's daughter who will remember. The rest of the spindle was plain, but that one phrase suggests a quiet intention to be recalled, however faintly, in the hands of future kin. You sit now beside the woman as she speaks. She doesn't notice you. Or maybe she does. Either way, the story continues. About the fire that almost took the grain shed. About the child born in a storm. About the goat that refused to leave the chieftain's hall and the night no one dared remove it. You laugh. So does she. And through it all you realize she is choosing what survives. The sagas may capture kings and battles, but these women curated the soul of the culture, deciding which jokes endured, which wrongs faded, which glories gained polish with time. They tended memory like a hearth, feeding it slowly, never letting it die. The woman's voice quiets. She closes her eyes, not in sleep, but in reflection. The wind shifts through grass, and somewhere far below, a child asks a question. A new story begins. The voices fade now, leaving only the hush of grass brushing stone and the echo of footsteps long since past. The Viking women you've met tonight are no longer just shadows at the edge of sagas. They're the ones who stirred the stew, spun the sails, guarded the gossip, and shaped the fate of farms, families, and legacies. Let that truth settle in gently, that power doesn't always wear iron or roar from ships. Sometimes it whispers in looms, lingers in stories, and passes from hand to hand in the shape of a single iron key. As you drift, imagine the warmth of a hearth tended by steady hands. the clink of bead trade in a misty market, the quiet resolve of a widow locking her storeroom for the night. If this story helped you rest tonight, drop your time and city in the comments and tell me which forgotten woman you'd like to meet next.